Dawn comes slowly to the Belarusian marshes. A pale light lifts over reed beds and black pine, and the first smoke of 1,000 campfires drifts upward. From a distance, especially through binoculars, the scene looks ordinary. Columns of trucks on a muddy road, tank silhouettes crouched in the trees, a row of canvas tents beside a shallow river bend. But get closer, and the lines blur. The trucks are timber frames on wagon wheels. The tanks are plywood skins stretched over wooden ribs, their tracks painted onto canvas. The tents are real enough, but no soldiers sleep inside. Stoves burn to raise visible smoke, and radio operators send traffic all morning. The operators are real, the messages are not. It is June 1944. The Red Army is about to open its largest offensive of the war, and before the first artillery salvo thunders, an army made of shadows has already crossed the border. This is the Soviet art of deception, Maskirovka, practiced at a scale few in the German High Command imagined possible. The word means disguise, camouflage, concealment. In practice, it stretches wider. Maskirovka is about controlling what the enemy sees, hears, and expects. It is the patient misdirection that puts reserves in the wrong place, the false radio net that breathes life into a phantom division, the night movement that leaves only tire tracks by dawn. It is a culture and a method embedded in field regulations taught to sappers and staff officers alike, and rehearsed in countless smaller operations across the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union had learned its lessons the hard way. In 1941, deception belonged to the attacker, Germany, and surprise broke the front wide open. By 1944, surprise would belong to the defender-turned-attacker, Stavka, the Soviet High Command, and it would help shatter the very German grouping that had spearheaded the invasion, Army Group Center. The plan was codenamed Operation Bagration. Its geographic canvas was Belarus, the rivers Western Dwina and Dnieper, the cities Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Babrusk, and Minsk, the peat swamps and forests that soak up sound and swallow roads. The operation would be carried out by 4 fronts, army groups in Soviet terminology, under commanders who had learned, adapted, and survived. Ivan Begremyan's 1st Baltic Front on the north, Ivan Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front pressing toward Orsha and Vitebsk, Georgy Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front at Mogilev, and Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front striking at Babrusk and beyond. On paper, the Red Army had mass. In the field, it still needed more than mass. Germany's command, intelligence, and rail network could move panzer reserves quickly, if they knew where to send them. Maskirovka's true purpose was to make sure they did not. Long before the first assault battalions moved to their jump-off lines, the work began. Staff officers were issued concealment plans, detailed appendices to the operational orders that listed not only the number of guns and tanks, but also how each would be hidden from aerial reconnaissance, when and where they would move at night, and what dummy positions would be built to draw fire and attention away from the real ones. Sapper battalions cut and hauled timber, building false bridges downstream from intended crossing sites. Engineers erected dummy airfields with wooden aircraft. Rough silhouettes, yes, but convincing enough at altitude and in low light to draw bombs away from operational strips hidden under camouflage netting. Radio dissection teams set up across the theater. Some of them operated ghost nets, full schedules of chatter, call signs, and message formatting that mimicked the habits of real units. A handful of these nets suggested a major Soviet concentration in the south, toward Ukraine, where the Germans already expected a large summer offensive. Others hinted at a threat near Army Group North. The shadow talk was designed to give German signals intelligence what it wanted to hear, and to keep alive a long-standing assumption inside OKH, the German Army High Command, that the main Soviet weight would come elsewhere. At the same time, real movements in Belarus were shrouded. Road marches took place at night on dispersal routes. Bridges were crossed in darkness, planks wrapped in felt to muffle wheels. Headlights' hoods slitted down to narrow cat eyes. Tanks were parked in forest stands under fresh-cut branches that were dampened to reduce dust and heat signature. Pontoon parks, vast floating stores of bridging, were hidden on backwaters under reed screens. Artillery positions were capped with roofs of net and burlap, not to stop a shell, but to break up shapes. On the ground, deception had a human texture. A sapper sergeant in a forward battalion would be handed a sketch, a fake crossing site to be built on a shallow bend, complete with ramp, tire ruts, and a pontoon section left in place. At the real site upstream, men labored in silence, laying trestles piece by piece beside the bank, waiting for the last night to swing them into the current. A signals platoon in a secondary sector carried heavy reel-to-reel sets up a hill, established a division headquarters in a farmhouse, then broadcast on a daily schedule. Smoke detachments rehearsed laying screens that would, at the last minute, erase the riverbank from enemy view, long enough for assault boats to push off. The quantities are difficult to capture, but they are not mythic. Soviet documentation and post-war studies describe thousands of decoys and dummy installations across the entire front. In Belarus alone, dummy tank parks were assembled with wooden turrets and canvas hulls. Model aircraft were placed at decoy airstrips. Fake camps spread along roadsides, tents, cook fires, even laundry lines. Aerial reconnaissance above the timberline would see what it expected to see: units at rest, not units gathering to strike. German intelligence and commanders did see movement in Belarus, but they had to interpret it. Their analysts read the traffic, weighed reports, and made a choice. They believed the decisive Soviet blow would fall further south, against Army Group North Ukraine. The Red Army encouraged that belief by mounting demonstrative attacks and keeping up radio traffic that suggested a deeper buildup in the Ukrainian theater. The result was simple and decisive. When the first Soviet guns opened in Belarus, many of the nearest operational reserves were not within easy reach. The strategic frame was set by Stavka, but the operational heartbeat belonged to the front commanders and their armies. Among the boldest was Rokossovsky. His approach to the southern prongs of the offensive, against the German positions at Bobruisk, was a study in both deception and operational cunning. He argued for two axes, not one: a northern thrust to pin, and a southern thrust through the marshes, where the enemy considered the ground difficult, and therefore less likely. According to his own post-war recollection, he defended the plan even under personal pressure, insisting that the terrain could be crossed with careful preparation. That preparation included not only corduroyed roads and widened tracks, but the blandly named arts of concealment, building up the southern concentration slowly, at night, and keeping the daylight picture ambiguous. The northern sectors saw similar patterns scaled to different landscapes. Cherniakovsky's front before Orsha camouflaged its heavy guns under straw matting and net, while engineers built dummy gun lines to absorb attention. Bagramyan's front shaped a series of feints and concealed redistributions that suggested a posture rather than a punch. As in many Soviet operations, the partisans threaded through the plan. In the weeks before the opening, partisan detachments, local fighters directed by central staff, cut rails and harassed isolated posts. Their actions had two effects: practical and psychological. Practically, they slowed repair and supply, complicating German movement. Psychologically, they deepened a sense of uncertainty. Where disturbances were reported, it was never clear if they signaled a true threat nearby or only the background noise of a partisan war. The Red Army understood this uncertainty and, in the final nights, synchronized it. Major sabotage actions coincided with the last movements of assault troops and pontoon columns creeping to their start lines. Exact figures for rails destroyed and trains delayed vary by source and remain a matter of estimation. What is not contested is the fact of interruption. Rails blown, telegraph lines cut, patrols scattered, rear area commanders kept awake and guessing. Inside the Soviet camps, the last hours were filled with quiet adjustments. Assault battalions were briefed against sand table models. Camouflage nets were folded back from gun muzzles. Boats were carried to the water's edge and covered in brush. At decoy positions, smoke pots were lit, and voices kept up for observers watching from mile-high altitudes. Signals detachments sent more messages than usual, padding the ether with regularity. And just before dawn, smoke companies laid broad curtains over river bends. On 22 June 1944, the anniversary of the day Germany had invaded the Soviet Union 3 years earlier, Soviet artillery opened up along hundreds of kilometers. The ground shook under heavy guns and Katyusha salvos. In the north, near Vitebsk, assault units went forward behind creeping barrages, their river crossings already screened. Near Orsha, Soviet sappers raced to throw their secret bridges. At Mogilev, attack groups probed for seams. And in the south, through the marshy shoulders north of the Pripyat, Rokossovsky's southern group pushed into the ground the Germans thought too poor to carry a major attack. As Soviet units burst through, the decoys behind them became irrelevant, left standing, sometimes to be photographed later. What mattered now was the lag the deception had induced. German staff needed hours, sometimes days, to absorb the scale and direction of the assault. They called for reserves that were too far away or misallocated. Some local commanders fought with skill and stubbornness. No deception could change that. But the larger map had already been tilted. At Vitebsk, German divisions became trapped and were broken. Orsha fell after fierce fighting against well-prepared anti-tank lines. At Mogilev, the German defense was compressed, then cracked. Rokossovsky's two axes converged on Babrusk and bagged large formations, and the road to Minsk began to open. By early July, the Red Army entered Minsk and encircled German forces east of the city. The casualties and losses were immense and unevenly recorded. Post-war figures vary widely, especially on the German side, and remain a point of debate among historians. What is not disputed is the scale. Army Group Center, once the spearhead, was torn apart. Large numbers of men were killed or captured. Formations dissolved. Command structures were replaced in haste. Within days of the offensive's start, the German commander of Army Group Center was relieved, and a crisis echelon took charge over a battlefield already slipping away. What, precisely, did deception add to firepower and maneuver in this outcome? The answer is neither magical nor minimal. It is a layer of conditions that multiplies the effect of everything else. Consider two examples from the operational level. First, the placement of Soviet heavy artillery before Orsha. If the Germans had clearly identified the dense grouping of guns and their supply roads earlier, they would have intensified counter-battery preparation, bombed key logistics nodes, and forced the Soviets to displace. The concealment plans did not make the guns invulnerable. They made them timely. They were where they needed to be, intact, on the morning they were needed most. Second, the southern thrusts in Rokossovsky's sector. The choice of ground and the concealment of buildup convinced the defender to weigh the wrong places. The marshes were not impassable. No terrain truly is to an army that must move. But they were awkward, and the defender gambled that the attacker would not pay the cost. Deception did not flatten the marshes. It persuaded a rational enemy to put its best responses elsewhere. At the tactical level, deception saved lives in dozens of small ways. A fake bridge drew an extra bomb load. A wooden airfield took a raid that might have closed a real strip for a day. A dummy tank park convinced a reconnaissance pilot that a unit was at rest, not on the move. Some of these choices were made far behind the lines, in air photo interpretation rooms and command bunkers. Some were made in the cockpit, in seconds, as a pilot picked a target. Deception negotiated with human attention, and attention is a scarce resource in war. There is also the moral cost, and its inversion. Soldiers at dummy camps cooked, cleaned, moved about, targets without combat purpose, because their performance invited real fire. Radio operators tapped out messages knowing that enemy direction finding might home in on their aerials. Smoke teams worked under observation, visible to the very watchers they were blinding. Maskirovka did not happen only behind the front. It happened on the front, and those who performed it often occupied dangerous addresses on the battlefield. Not every deception worked. Some decoys were too crude. Some German observers were too experienced. Some bridges were too obvious to hide. There are always counterexamples. In places, the Germans read the signs correctly, repositioned in time, fought a coherent defense. The Eastern Front was an enormous living system. No single technique ever decided it alone. But deception changed proportions, and in a summer operation where timing and concentration were everything, changing proportions was enough. The culture that made this possible stretched backward and forward. Soviet field regulations, revised during the war, did not treat concealment as a decorative art. They assigned it tasks, resources, and command emphasis.
Camouflage officers were attached to staffs. Smoke units were regularized. Deception annexes thickened orders. Training schools taught commanders to assume that what was seen by the enemy would be contested, and to plan as though their own eyes were fallible. Meanwhile, the labor economy of the Red Army, its capacity to mobilize thousands of sappers, engineers, and drivers for tasks that did not directly fire a shot, was harnessed to build illusions. Sawhorses cut into silhouettes, riverbanks dressed with tire ruts, bridges that would fold into water and then vanish under netting at first light. On the German side, intelligence organizations built on early war success struggled to recalibrate. By 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer an open plain that could be surveyed by a handful of pilots and mapped by intuition. It was a layered battle space of smoke, screens, and false signals. German commanders were not blind. Many were exceptionally skilled, but they were constrained by assumption, strained logistics, and strategic overcommitment. Deception did not create those constraints, it exploited them. There is a temptation to tell this story as a parable, the clever ruse that won the day. That would be a distortion. The Red Army in 1944 had rebuilt itself in industrial and human terms. It fought with massed artillery, increasingly proficient combined arms, and growing operational art. Maskirovka did not replace those strengths. It amplified them by shaping the enemy's sense of where and when to apply their own. Yet there is also a different temptation, to reduce deception to a footnote. That, too, misses the point. War is a contest not only of metal and muscle, but of belief and prediction. When an entire theater command is persuaded that the decisive blow will fall elsewhere, the blow that does fall lands harder. In Belarus, in June and July 1944, it landed with historic force. After Minsk fell, the plywood tanks were left behind in the forest clearings. Some were taken apart for stovewood. Some were photographed by advancing troops who laughed at them and kept moving. The men who had built them turned to other tasks, bridging new rivers, erecting real airfields on captured ground, concealing again for the next step west. The radio ghosts fell silent, or were reassigned to conjure other phantoms along the front. The cities that had been named on a staff map, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobroisk, returned to human scale. Streets were cleared. Survivors came out of cellars. Partisans tried to settle old accounts and find the living among the rubble. The decoys looked absurd beside the scale of real destruction, and that is instructive. Deception is small and human. It is carpentry and rope and timing and the patience to stand under a net for hours. But it has the power to tilt outcomes, to buy the attacker a day and deny the defender a rail line, and in that day, rivers are crossed and lines unravel. Soviet staff recorded their methods. Post-war analysts tallied outcomes under dry headings: surprise achieved, grouping concealed, enemy reserves misdirected. The soldiers who had made the illusions seldom made memoirs about them. Their craft was meant to be unseen, and when it worked perfectly, it was mistaken for reality. A few scenes endure. A partisan squad at night, listening to rails ping under a cooling sky after another charge. A smoke detachment kneeling by a riverbank with long-handled pots, watching their own cover roll away like fog. A signals corporal tapping the last lines of a fake order and glancing through a cracked window at a wooden tank beneath a pine. None of them knew whether the observer, up there,
in a German reconnaissance plane was seeing the false image or the real one a few kilometers away. They only knew their fraction of a plan. Deception demands that kind of faith, the belief that the invisible acts, the quiet ones, have their hour. In the end, Operation Bagration did not succeed because plywood tanks frightened everyone. It succeeded because those tanks, those false camps, those dummy bridges and smoky curtains formed part of a coherent whole. They shaped perceptions long enough for armies to arrive on riverbanks in darkness, for assault boats to launch unseen, for artillery to open undisturbed from positions the enemy had not quite mapped, and for reserves to sprint toward threats that existed only on paper and in the air. War is fought by bodies, but it is steered by minds. In the summer of 1944, on a front where millions moved, the Soviet mind of war, its planners, engineers, carpenters, and radio men, compelled the enemy to look the wrong way at the right time. And when the enemy looked back, the fake army was still there. Smoke curling from its cook fires, wooden tracks in the mud, holding the gaze just long enough for the real one to pass by in the night. There are uncertainties in the details, and honesty requires them. How many decoy tanks stood in which clearing is not always recorded. Numbers and their attributions differ by front and by source. The exact scale of partisan sabotage in the final days is described with varying totals. The effect, however, disruption synchronized with the offensive, is clear in both Soviet and German accounts. The specific distribution of German reserves and the decisive weight of deception versus misjudgment remain debated. But the broad outline has remained consistent across archival studies. Masks were raised across the Belarusian theater. False pictures were painted in the airwaves and on the ground. And when the offensive opened on 22 June 1944, Army Group Center faced an offensive whose true shape had been hidden until the moment it mattered. This is not a story of tricks, then, but of method. Method requires discipline. A colonel enforcing light control in a forest park. A major signing off on a decoy plan that will never be seen in his own after-action report. A squad leader ordering his men to keep a fire burning under an empty pot because, from a mile up, a wisp of smoke says bivouac. The rewards are rarely dramatic in the moment, but in the ledger of a campaign, they accumulate into surprise. If we walk back to the river bend where we began, dawn is now full. The fake army keeps up its performance. A sentry pacing, a mechanic leaning against a wooden turret, a radio man bent over his set. Somewhere unseen, the real crossing erupts. Boats racing, ropes hauled, men pouring across a hidden bridge under a moving wall of smoke. The fake tanks hold the gaze a few minutes longer. The real ones, made of steel and oil and noise, are already on the far bank. If we walk back to the river bend where we began, dawn is now full. The fake army keeps up its performance. A sentry pacing, a mechanic leaning against a wooden turret, a radio man bent over his set. Somewhere unseen, the real crossing erupts. Boats racing, ropes hauled, men pouring across a hidden bridge under a moving wall of smoke. The fake tanks hold the gaze a few minutes longer. The real ones, made of steel and oil and noise, are already on the far bank. By nightfall, lines that had seemed permanent in German maps are broken. By the end of the week, towns fall in sequence. In a month, the front is hundreds of kilometers west. The decoys remain for a while, markers of a technique that worked precisely because it asked to be mistaken for ordinary life. And perhaps that is the last truth of Maskirovka. It did not aim for theatricality. It aimed to make the battlefield feel familiar to the enemy. Roads and camps and tanks in predictable places, until the moment when everything that mattered was happening just out of sight.